Welcome back in, ladies and gentlemen. With the conclusion of week 12 of NFL football, it has brought us to about 3/4 of the way through the fantasy football season. And as we've done twice so far, I think it's right about time to do a season recap, just going over everything that's transpired across the fantasy football landscape thus far this season. So we'll be doing our quarter season recap today, talking about all the major fantasy football positions of the quarterback, the running back, the wide receiver, the tight end, what has gone into it, what has gone into the production and success of some of these wide receivers, tight ends, and other positions, where they stand so far, and what the rest of the season, as it gets crucially down to the playoffs, is going to look like for a lot of these players. So as always, like the video, comment down below what you think of the rankings so far, some of the shocking risers and some of the shocking fallers over the course of 2023 season. Subscribe to the channel if you are new here, and I'm going to go ahead and cue that intro. Welcome back into Twin Takes Fantasy Football, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday, at least those of you who celebrate it here in the United States. And in this short month we have in between major family gatherings and holiday events, we know that this is a short respite from the holiday season, from family obligations, which we can turn our entirety of our attention towards the most critical part of the fantasy football season. So I know something we've talked about in the quarter season recap and the half season recap is how do we interpret the data that's been given to us given the sample size. And that's something that's always going to be a major point of discussion, is how you evaluate players. You know, you can always cherry pick data points to represent a different top 10 list, how you quantify the best producer, whether it's fantasy points per game, whether it's fantasy points over an entire season. And I mean, this is why so many accounts on X, Instagram, TikTok, they get so many views, because they can create these really hyperbolic or these really clickbaity, hot takey lists because they're cherry picking certain data points. And, you know, that's how a lot of people, especially in the fantasy community, they try to, create like this system or this method in which they understand, like they cherry pick certain data points that they think are more relevant to fantasy football than others. That's why you hear about ADOT, yards per route run, yards per target, so many different things. But we'll try to break down all the data that's being recorded here right now in the Fantasy Pros website that I've pulled up. It's just basically the top players at each fantasy position based on how many points they've scored throughout the entire season. So we're going to the most basic fundamental data points over the course of the 12 weeks of football played, who has generated the most fantasy points at their respective position. And now some of these things, as we break down the data set, sometimes it's more about who's consistent rather than who's been actually really productive. Who's in some cases, especially when it comes to running backs, it's a more of an indicative of who's been healthy rather than who's been good. So we'll try to kind of break down, who have been the real winners for fantasy football this season, and whether their reflection here on the chart of the 3/4 of the way through the season is going to be indicative of fantasy football success in the most crucial segment of the fantasy football season, which is the playoffs. So with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's dive into the actual video. As always, we're going to go through the top 20 or so positions of running backs and wide receivers, kind of the more crucial skill position players of fantasy football. And then we'll jump into the top 10 to 15 players at the tight end and quarterback position as well. I don't think those need as much in-depth analysis, so we'll kind of keep those sections brief. But let's start it out. Tyreek Hill. I don't really think needs much analysis. Everyone knows that he's been the best positional player in fantasy football and NFL football in 2023. He is having a historic season. I think if he averages just over 110 yards per game for each of the next 6 games, he will break the 2,000 yard wide receiving mark, which has never been done before. And he also has a very good chance to break Calvin Johnson's, aka Megatron's, single season receiving record. I know I was doing a very hot takey video in week 1, hot takes after week 1, and I said this might be the greatest offense to ever grace the NFL landscape, and I got a lot of hate and people calling me ignorant for that. But I think 12 weeks through the season, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that this Dolphins offense, and especially a player of Tyreek's skill set, not only with his speed and dynamicism in that aspect, but also because he's just one of the most purest route runners, one of the most purest and safest hands in the game. All of these make him a top tier athlete, and put in Mike McDaniel's high-powered Dolphins offense, it does kind of translate to one of the best NFL offenses we've seen in the NFL in probably the last decade, as well as just some insane production at skill position players. We're talking about Tyreek, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, Tua, all those guys. So yeah, Tyreek Hill, very, very much deserving of the number one position. And I think the same could be said about Keenan Allen as well. He not only has he been consistent, he has managed to avoid the injury bug. Let's knock on wood for all you fantasy managers out there coming up to the playoffs. But, he's really benefited from Kellen Moore coming in and revamping the Chargers offense. He's, again, avoided the injury bug, and he has been incredible. Not only has he had those insane week-winning performances, putting up over 100 yards, multiple touchdowns, getting you into the 30 to 40-point range, but he's been doing this very consistently. He has had very, very, very few weeks in which he's absolutely sunk or torpedoed your fantasy football team. So really, Keenan is right there. He's the 1B to Tyreek's 1A, and it's a guy that can win you a week, but also has very, very, very rarely let you down. And obviously this has come at the sacrifice of Joshua Palmer, Jalen Guyton, Mike Williams going out for the entire season with a torn ACL, then obviously Quentin Johnston not taking that next step as a rookie wide receiver. Obviously, Austin Eckler has slowed down a little bit. He's looking a little rough coming back from injury, but Keenan Allen is obviously the focal point of that offense in Los Angeles and has been incredible for fantasy football. CeeDee Lamb really come on strong. I know we talked about this in one of the earlier recaps where, he was sitting on that kind of the outside looking in on the top 10. And it was a standpoint of, listen, through the first 4 games of the season, the Cowboys had just been blowing out the opponents. It was the Giants, the Patriots. Obviously, they had that one really faux pas game against the Arizona Cardinals, but they just didn't need the passing attack. They just didn't need Dak to throw the ball. They didn't need CeeDee Lamb to go out there and be the dominant wide receiver that he is. They're finishing games with Rico Dowdle and Deuce Vaughn running the ball. And when you're winning by 30 points, there's no reason to really jeopardize your top end players like CeeDee and Dak. But as the season has progressed, we knew that they weren't going to be in these massive shootouts. They weren't going to be, or not shootouts, but these massive blowouts week in and week out. And therefore they have now had to rely on the passing game. Brandon Cooks has absolutely stepped his game up. CeeDee Lamb has become a dominant wide receiver, setting up the most, he has the most games in a row with 150 yards and 10 catches, 3 in a row. It's just been absolutely incredible. And he has certainly, earned his spot as part of the Mount Rushmore of wide receivers here in the top 4. Stephon Diggs, kind of something to talk about. I mean, he's always been incredibly consistent from the wide receiver position. He's always been, that focal point of the Buffalo Bills offense. Historically, ever since coming to Buffalo, his wide receiver finishes were wide receiver 2, wide receiver 7, wide receiver 3, and he's currently on track to finish the top 5 wide receiver again. Obviously, there's a little bit of snafu after that Monday night game against the Denver Broncos where, a little bit of drama crept into the locker room. People weren't sure how Stephon was going to respond. But after, and 2 weeks removed from that game, it seems like things have calmed down. Cooler heads have prevailed. Stephon Diggs did catch a touchdown in this past week's game, did return to being a top 24 fantasy wide receiver on the week. And, even as a fan, I know it might not be the healthiest behavior for the Buffalo Bills, especially as they currently sit on the outside looking in from the NFL playoff perspective. But from the fantasy perspective, we know from a very illustrious history of this, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if Stephon Diggs is going to complain and moan, then obviously they're going to have to hyper-target him to keep him happy, given that he is the star wide receiver, and we know what the impact of a star wide receiver can make on an NFL team. So we should see that, hopefully this is not something. It didn't implode the locker room. It didn't implode the relationship with Josh Allen. It was a hiccup. They seem to get back on track, and I'm sure Stephon will be a very crucial aspect of this offense going forward. A.J. Brown, what more can be said about him other than the fact that, he's just been absolutely dominant as a wide receiver for fantasy. The Jalen Hurts to A.J. Brown stack has been absolutely lethal combination for fantasy football this year. Again, like CeeDee, A.J. also tied a very important record, which was most games with 125 yards receiving in a row at 5. And just, how dominant and incredible the players in the top 5 from Brown, Diggs, Lamb, Allen, and Hill have always been from the wide receiver standpoint. Again, I'm going to beat a dead horse and just say that this is kind of the changing of the guard, where no longer the running back position is going to be the crux of fantasy football. We're going to see a lot less running backs taken in the first round. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we dive into the running back side of it. But, wide receivers are becoming much more crucial to the NFL offense. The play schemes are being revolved around the passing game rather than the running game. And these guys just stay healthier and produce more. So I'm going to start seeing, all these guys. You're going to look at Hill, Allen, probably not Allen, but Hill, Lamb, Diggs, Brown, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. All these guys will be first-round picks next year, really. And I would be very shocked to see more than 4 running backs be taken in the first round going forward. Amon-Ra St. Brown, this is the thing where we got to talk about, like, is he truly the wide receiver 6 on the season? I think he kind of has earned this spot. Obviously he's earned this spot through his production. He's an incredible wide receiver, and he's certainly a top 10 wide receiver for fantasy. But I think just with the injuries to Justin Jefferson, with the injuries just surrounding Jamar Chase, those are 2 guys that I'd probably say more talented than Amon-Ra. And when it comes to week-winning performances, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase have absolutely showed that ability to go out and win you a week with a 30-point performance, racking up over 150 yards and multiple touchdowns. Amon-Ra, sometimes we talk about, in the quarter season recap, not having enough data. I think this might be, especially when it comes to analyzing NFL production, too many data points. I think this is more of a reflection of Amon-Ra's consistency rather than his ability to go out and be overly productive and win you a week. Now, there's certainly, don't hear what I'm not saying, there is certainly value to a wide receiver that's never going to have a bust game. I don't think Amon-Ra has a single bust game so far this season. He's been wildly productive when it comes to just delivering good fantasy games. I mean, we're going to steal the nickname from Karl Malone because Amon-Ra St. Brown should be the mailman. He just delivers, but he's not going to deliver you like those 30, 40-point week-winning games. So there is value in Amon-Ra as the fact that he will never let you down. He'll never torpedo a week, but you do need a little bit more oomph to get you to those week-winning performances because 18 points a week, it's nice, but it's not going to be those ones that are going to take you to the championship. DJ Moore has been, a very wild wide receiver to analyze. Obviously, I think he has a great stretch down the run. There's been massive improvements in Justin Fields throughout the second half of the season, or at least since he's returned from that injury, or from the injury in which Tyson Bagent was taking over the helm for the Chicago Bears. But DJ Moore has an incredible connection with Justin Fields, and he is by far and away the go-to weapon on that offense. And this was interesting because people were kind of discounting DJ Moore prior to the season because they thought this was going to be a very run-heavy offense between Khalil Herbert, drafting Roshan Johnson, Justin Fields being primarily a dynamic runner, and that's where he was doing most of his damage in 2022. They thought the passing game was going to need to expand a little bit more before DJ Moore is getting involved. Well, with Khalil Herbert's injuries, with Roshan not truly established himself as a rookie, with Deontay Foreman being essentially ancient as far as running back terms, and with Justin Fields trying to develop as a passer, they have not been bringing out the designed run game for Justin Fields as much, and they have been designing a lot more plays to DJ Moore. It's very clear that DJ Moore is the number 1 option in this offense, agnostic of any of the running back options. And in the Monday night game versus the Minnesota Vikings, whether they were up, whether they were down in the game, regardless of the play script, plays were being designed for DJ Moore, screen passes, downfield passes. It just seems that he's going to be incredibly productive and consistent no matter what the game script calls for, and he's not pigeonholed to a singular type of usage. He's being used again in the screen game, passes out of the backfield, looking at, he did run a couple deep routes. He was seen crossing over the flat a little bit. So, I mean, I think that all that versatility is going to be very, very good for DJ Moore for the rest of the season. I think he's going to be certainly a league winner for certain teams. Mike Evans has just been incredible all season. I mean, he's certainly worthy of being a top 10 wide receiver. Vastly outperformed his ADP. Chris Godwin has been very, very disappointing as it comes from a fantasy standpoint, and Baker Mayfield has certainly surprised us as it comes to what his production has been with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans is by far and away the number 1 option, and in an offense that struggles with running the football, struggles with getting bodies and winning the battle in the trenches. Mike Evans is being used more than ever and has been, this has been an incredible season for people who bought in low or traded low for Mike Evans. Jamar Chase has just been really rough. I'm very concerned for his ability to produce down the stretch. Obviously, we know that due to the wrist injury to Joe Burrow, he'll be out for the rest of the season. And Jamar Chase's value is inherently linked with an elite quarterback such as Joe Burrow. And, given that they have their connection stemming all the way back to LSU. Jamar Chase, I believe he's one of those guys that's, incredibly talented. And maybe despite the ineptitude of Jake Browning, maybe his talent will overcome that, but we've seen what has happened with Garrett Wilson and Zach Brown or Tim Boyle, whoever throwing him the ball, and how detrimental that has been to Garrett Wilson's fantasy career. Let's go take a look. Garrett Wilson is sitting, all the way down at 25. Sometimes a situation can be a little impactful no matter how talented you are. Moving on, Puka Nacua, a guy that I really like. I think he's going to be a fantasy stalwart for years to come. Obviously, it's going to be on the back of Matthew Stafford. As we saw, the game splits, the yardage, the production, the fantasy scores, vastly differed between Brett Rippon throwing the ball versus Matthew Stafford. But as long as you have a competent quarterback throwing on the ball, I think Puka Nacua is going to be a great wide receiver coming forward. A very great story coming out of the later rounds of the draft. And we saw even with Cooper Kupp taking the field, it didn't really hamper Puka's production that much. I think there's only one game in which Matthew Stafford was healthy that Puka scored single-digit fantasy points. Well, now two, given what happened in week 12. But yeah, I think Cooper, he's getting a little bit older. He's struggled quite a bit with injuries this season. Puka, I think, is going to lay claim on that wide receiver 1 position in Los Angeles sooner rather than later. And those of you who picked up and bought low on him, congratulations. I think he should, as long as Matthew Stafford stays healthy, he'll certainly be getting that very high target volume that he saw start out the season, and could definitely be a league-winning option. Tank Dell, I think this is honestly not adequately valuing Tank Dell. Again, we're comparing this over a 12-week time period, but unfortunately, Tank Dell has only played about 8 of those games. He missed quite a few games from the weeks 5 to 8 with, I forget what type of injury it was, but the most important part was he wasn't playing football. And even with that limited data, or the limited production that he's had outside of that time missing, he is still the wide receiver 11. He and CJ Stroud, again, we have to talk about the quarterback to rookie connection. Obviously, it stems all the way back to draft day when after the Texans took CJ Stroud, CJ texted the general manager and D'Amico Ryan said, hey, listen, get this guy, get Tank Dell, keep him here in Houston. So CJ was a big fan of Tank's game. Tank has immediately come in and established himself as a vital part of this Texans offense. Obviously, you have Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator, who descends from the Kyle Shanahan tree. Obviously, very, very prolific offensive minds, and obviously does correlate with the incredible breakout rookie campaign of not only Offensive Rookie of the Year eligible CJ Stroud, but honestly, he's in the race for some MVP votes as it stands. So, being the quote unquote 1A or 1B wide receiver in conjunction with Nico Collins, whoever you want to view, Tank Dell is going to be very, very valuable, attached to a guy who's been just so productive as CJ Stroud. Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 12. This has been the name of the game the entire season. He's just part of that 49ers offense that's very, very volatile. He'll have his up weeks, he'll have his down weeks, but overall, and it's going to be frustrating when he has those weeks where he's just not utilized and all the production goes to George Kittle or a Deebo Samuel, but he'll still provide you some good fantasy production, and overall will look good at the end of the season. Devontae Adams, it's been a rough season for him. It's been a rough season for the Raiders in general, with Aiden O'Connell taking over at quarterback for the rest of the season. I don't know how much I trust Devontae Adams for the stretch. Adam Thielen, I think it was a great start to the season, but I think his age is caught up to him. I think injuries caught up to him. Things are kind of a dumpster fire in Carolina right now. They just fired Frank Reich. There's a lot of things going on with the Panthers that I don't necessarily love. And I'm going to go ahead and say maybe Adam Thielen, maybe not a top 24 wide receiver going forward. I think I would be pivoting to other options for your playoff stretch. Jordan Addison, I love the talent. He has been my favorite wide receiver in the rookie class. I have been singing his praises. He was my number 1 wide receiver coming into this season from the rookie class. It's just, it's been a very, very detrimental situation around him. Obviously, he was elevated with the Justin Jefferson injury, and then Kirk Cousins goes down. You have Josh Dobbs, who has, again, great Hollywood story. Love the kid, want to root for the kid, but he just not providing the same quarterback play that Kirk Cousins had given to Addison previously. So it's just, unfortunately, it's going to be a rough situation. And then obviously with Justin Jefferson being activated off IR, should be back in week 14 after the Vikings bye in week 13. It's going to really eat into Jordan Addison's production. I'd probably be looking for options elsewhere for the fantasy run. Michael Pittman, Gardner Minshew, just a gunslinger. And yeah, I think, a little bit undervalued coming into the season, but he's proven himself to be an alpha wide receiver. He's a guy that I think is a solid wide receiver 2 option week in and week out, even throughout the playoffs. And the Colts do have some matchups. We just got news that Jonathan Taylor will be out for the rest of the season, fantasy season, not NFL, the fantasy season with thumb surgery. So I think it's what we're going to add to the target share and opportunity share that Michael Pittman receives. Nico Collins, we can just copy and paste from Tank Dell. Devonta Smith, again, productive, attached to a great offense. This is going to be the same. It's honestly, I just want to copy and paste from the end of 2022. Devonta Smith, the real breakout last season was when Dallas Goedert went down with that broken arm. Guess what? Dallas Goedert breaks his arm again in week 10, 11. Either way, Goddard won't be back until after the fantasy season. Devonta Smith should be a very, very high-end wide receiver too. The Eagles are going to be in some absolutely incredible matchups going forward. They face the 49ers. They face the Cowboys again. So yeah, I think there's going to be some shootouts. They're going to be need to very big emphasis on the offensive, on offense being generated out of the Philadelphia Eagles. And Devonta Smith will be great. Jacoby Myers, no, drop him, no. Chris Olave, really rough situation down in New Orleans. Obviously leaves the game with... Probably misses a few weeks with the concussion protocol after he left the game in week 12. It's been a real rough season for Chris Olave, and he's kind of a bust. He kind of falls into the whole Garrett Wilson situation where they have been really, really hampered based on the quarterback play and the situation they've been in despite their talent. And hopefully, the situation gets better for them as they grow into their third, fourth, fifth year. A couple of the names, Calvin Ridley. He's had 2 good games. I don't want to overreact because, out of this entire 12-game span, he has had 3 good games. 3 good games. And yes, I know they correspond with Zay Jones being back in the offense, so maybe that was the key to unlocking Calvin Ridley. However, the past 2 games have been significantly positive matchups for the wide receiver position. So I want to see what Calvin Ridley do it in a more of a neutral game script or more of a neutral matchup. That's going to challenge him with some stronger DB play. I see the optimism for Calvin Ridley. I'm not sold on it just yet. Sutton has been low-key one of the more consistent wide receivers. I think he's a great flex option, and DeAndre Hopkins is really at the mercy of Will Levis. Again, Jalen Waddle, very disappointing year. Zay Flowers is the last guy I'll talk about here with, I think he's a sneaky guy to be a league winner when it comes to playoffs at the wide receiver position. We saw his insane target share in week 1 without Mark Andrews. He had 10 targets. In game 1, as a rookie, that is unheard of. We saw how valuable Zay Flowers was in week 12 with the first game that Mark Andrews missed. Obviously, in week 11, it would have been a much bigger game if they had let that 168-yard touchdown stand. Zay Flowers is going to be absolutely crucial to the Ravens offense for the rest of the season and should be putting up monster performances to carry you through the playoffs. Let's move on to the running back position. And this is, again, I want to talk about, this is going to be a little bit harder to talk about because, it's easier to give credit to a lot of the wide receivers because a lot of them have been healthy and, they've earned their positions throughout the top 20. Running backs is going to be a little bit more tricky though, because I'm looking through this list and some of these players, they haven't been fantastic. They've just been healthy. So this is more of a list of guys that have stayed healthy for 12 games rather than who has really been delivering you winning performances for fantasy football. And then I do want to say outside of the top few players here, Christian McCaffrey is just, he'll be the 101 pick next year. That's just what he is. He's just such a cheat code for fantasy. He is the most valuable asset in fantasy football. Superflex, non-superflex does not matter. This man is incredible. We don't need to belabor this point anymore. Raheem Mostert, we thought his role was going to decrease with Devon Achane really breaking out in weeks 3 and 4 of the offense. However, with the Devon Achane injury, Raheem Mostert's place at the start of the offense or at the helm of the running offense for the Miami Dolphins has, really led to a lot of incredible production. I do think just based on what we've seen with recent trends, he's not a guy that I'm relying on for the fantasy playoffs. First off, it's a lot of rough matchups. We're looking at the New York Jets, the Dallas Cowboys, the Tennessee Titans, who have a pretty stout defensive line. It's just a really, really rough matchup when it comes to the running game. Also, Devon Achane should be back in week 13. And, in week 12, it was only a good game because of 2 garbage time rushing TDs that, frankly, he probably shouldn't have had, if I'm being 100% honest. So I think, his role in this offense will be decreased going forward. I think when he's facing more stiff competition, he's not going to get the garbage time TDs that he had so eloquently enjoyed over the past few weeks. I think Raheem Mostert, his production so far through 12 weeks has certainly earned him his spot here at the top of the running back list. But I'm iffy on him being a league winner for fantasy football. Travis Etienne has been incredible. I will admit when I was wrong on ETN coming into the season. He's been just absolutely a monster. He's been able to stay healthy. He's had just an insane opportunity share of any running back. I think he's rivaling Christian McCaffrey, like 70% of the rushing opportunities. I think he's like 77% for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and really been the heart and soul of that offense, especially with lackluster performances from Calvin Ridley and Trevor Lawrence throughout most of the season. So Travis Etienne, just incredible. I think he's this guy that you look at. He's matchup agnostic. He can do it through the air. He can do it on the ground. So if you were able to snag him in the 4th round of your drafts, I mean, congrats to you. It's been returned major dividends. Josh Jacobs, I mean, it took him a while, but he's finally returned. And again, I think, Josh Jacobs managers, I think looking at him being here at number 4 is going to be like, wow, I cannot believe he's here at number 4 because of just such a slow start to the season. But he has had over the second half in the past 6 games, he has had a very, very prolific fantasy output. And, with Aiden O'Connell coming in at quarterback, they're going to have to rely on the rush a little bit more. You're not going to be able to throw the ball as much downfield with Aiden O'Connell being a somewhat questionable arm strength. So yeah, Josh Jacobs screens out of the backfield, as well as the rushing, just the sheer volume he's getting will make him very valuable down the stretch here. Brian Robinson Jr. And some of these guys I'm going to talk about here as collective because I don't want to just repeat myself. So Brian Robinson Jr., Rachaad White, Gus Edwards, Isaiah Pacheco, James Cook. These are all guys that their position or their rankings here in the top 20 have been earned through the ability of availability. They have been healthy. They have not missed games. And therefore, just because they're putting up mediocre seems really, really harsh, but like average to below average games has kept them relevant for fantasy. And they just slowly tack on this is like what we're talking about. We have to figure out what data we want to use and what sample size we want to use in order to determine who's actually going to be, better players. I mean, I think it's no surprise that would you rather have Rachaad White going to the playoffs or Kyren Williams? Overall, over the course of the season, Rachaad White has generated the most total fantasy points, but if we're looking at average fantasy points per game, Kyren Williams has about 8 fantasy points more than Derrick Henry, Rachaad White, DeAndre Swift, Bijan Robinson. So it just depends on how you're going to look at these players and evaluate them. And obviously, I would view Kyren, if we want to view it over the games that they've actually played, I would view Kyren as more valuable than any of the guys I just mentioned right here. So yeah, this is hard. This is hard to judge because if you've been able to properly predict when these guys are having good games or utilize a Zach Moss when he was valuable before JTT came in and took over, have been able to utilize Kyren Williams for the time that he was healthy, I think you'd have a lot more success, streaming those guys or streaming waiver wire guys than if you had just stuck with Rachaad White week in and week out. And I know that's a very challenging thing to say, but that's just my opinion as it comes to the landscape of running backs, especially when you deal with a lot that are injury. A position that's very, very injury prone. DeAndre Swift, hasn't been the most successful run of games over the past few weeks, but again, anyone that has the dynamism of DeAndre Swift and is put behind the great offensive line that the Eagles produce. Again, Hall of Fame with like 3 Hall of Famers on that offensive line as it currently stands with Kelsey Mailata and Lane Johnson. And I think there's going to be a lot of production no matter who you put behind that line. We saw with the sharp decrease of Miles Sanders' production as he left the Eagles to go to the Carolina Panthers. So yeah, DeAndre Swift will continue to be just a same vein as the Amon-Ra St. Brown. He'll be the Karl Malone. He'll just deliver week in, week out with solid but not incredible fantasy performances. Derrick Henry, it's been a rough go of it, but I do want to highlight him because he has one of the best fantasy football matchups as it comes to the playoffs. Over the course of the playoffs, he faces the Houston Texans twice. In the past 7 games, 6 out of those 7 games, Derrick Henry has rushed for over 200 yards. And this is still a Houston Texans defense that is abysmal. Don't let the incredible offense fool you. The Texans defense is still 30th in run defense and giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to the running back position. Derrick Henry could absolutely be a league winner. Gus Edwards, again, I don't know if I want. I'm again, as a guy who's sitting in his office talking just absolute jack about fantasy players. For me to say that Gus Edwards isn't talented is an absolute farce. It's an absolute mockery of myself. I'm making a fool of myself by saying that. But what I'm talking about is his talent compared to a J.K. Dobbins or some of the other guys on this list. I think he's been more of the beneficiary of the offense. And I think as we're talking to quarterbacks, I think Lamar Jackson, he's obviously in MVP voting. He's a guy that's been incredible this season. Lamar has been truly incredible in this Todd Monken offense, but it's just been so lucky for Gus Edwards and inadvertently lucky for Lamar Jackson. They get to the 1 yard line and then they have Gus Bus pumping the touchdown from 1 or 2 yards out. So you're getting a lot of the fantasy football credit going to Gus Edwards when the actual credit in real life is going to Lamar Jackson and the rest of this offense around him. So I'm not sure if I would trust Gus Edwards to be a stalwart of my fantasy playoff team, because as soon as a touchdown variance stops happening, he returns to a very, very mediocre fantasy player. Isaiah Pacheco, I like him. Same vein as DeAndre Swift. He's just going to be consistent. He's part of a great offense. He's in a great the game scripts for the Kansas City Chiefs has been really very favorable for Isaiah Pacheco. A lot of times they have one of the best defenses Patrick Mahomes has ever played with. They don't have a lot of wide receivers to help move the ball. They're averaging the lowest points per game they have averaged since Patrick Mahomes took over as a starting quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. So yeah, they're going to be winning a lot of these games by running out the clock, running the ball on the ground, and trying to control the clock while their defense stymies opposing offenses, which plays perfectly into Isaiah Pacheco. Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery. Two guys that, frankly, their current rankings are very much undervaluing their current value to fantasy football. Yes, they cannibalize a little bit of each other's opportunities, but overall, just given the incredible offense that I think that Ben Johnson produces up there in Detroit and the overall talent of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, I do think that they have each enough of a unique role in their respective offense for them both to be productive. I mean, we've seen back-to-back weeks in which both of them have scored almost or over 20 fantasy points. And both have been wildly productive for fantasy football. They do have favorable schedules going into the fantasy playoffs, facing teams like the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings. And their rankings are here only because they both have, Jahmyr Gibbs, between injuries and also, taking time to ramp up as a rookie, David Montgomery being out with that ankle injury for about 4 weeks. He's missed a lot of time, but their current value, I think that would both value them as top 10 options when it comes to fantasy football right now. Alvin Kamara, again, he's just going to be valuable week in and week out just because of the dump-offs he gets from Derek Carr. Just the way that offense is designed there in New Orleans is going to give Alvin Kamara just so much value from the pass game work he receives, despite rarely finding the end zone so far this season. Breece Hall, it's been a really rough stretch of it. And yes, in the same vein we talk about Garrett Wilson, the same way we talk about Breece Hall, who is so unbelievably talented, but just handcuffed or handicapped by the ineptitude of the quarterback play. I still think he is a guy that is just so dynamic and just can break off a big run that you have to rely on him. You have to start him and hope to chase that upside. And yes, sometimes he will disappoint you, but he is a guy that, has just demonstrated that he is incredibly talented, even despite despite the ACL injury and being only 1 year removed from that ACL injury, and can break off big explosive runs. If he can get one of those runs, it can really make or break your fantasy day. And Joe Mixon, Kenneth Walker. I want to talk about Kenneth Walker for a second. It's rough. The injury situation with the emergence of Zach Charbonnet, with Zach Charbonnet gaining targets, I am pivoting really hardcore away from Kenneth Walker for the fantasy playoffs as it currently stands. But Joe Mixon, I think, is going to be a sneaky option to win a lot of people fantasy games. With Jake Browning coming in as quarterback, they're going to have to rely quite a bit more on the run game, on screens, on passes out of the backfield. So Joe Mixon, I think he's just going from sheer volume standpoint, will be very valuable for the fantasy playoffs. Another guy I really like a lot, I do want to hit on right here before we leave, Jerome Ford. Jerome Ford has an incredible matchup schedule for the fantasy football playoffs. When he's been healthy, I don't think being the 24th ranked running back has been it's really indicative of his current value to fantasy football. When he is healthy, and which has only been about 7 or 8 games so far this season. But again, you see he has a points per game total that, is impacted a little bit by the first few games where he was obviously starting behind Nick Chubb when Nick Chubb was healthy. But as soon as you look at the games in which he was the lead back, he jumps up into that point per game total that we're seeing with some of these top 10 running backs. And he's also tied to a team in the Cleveland Browns that's top 5 in every key running back metric, whether it's yards per game, total rush yards, running yards in a positive game script, rush plays in a negative game script. I mean, they are a team that really emphasizes the running game, and Jerome Ford is going to benefit greatly from that. And if you're able to snag him early in the season, he will definitely be a league winner. And obviously, Jonathan Taylor, really unfortunate situation that broke this morning with the thumb surgery, so he'll be out. Pretty devastating for players who are relying on him for the fantasy playoffs. If you manage to hold on to Zach Moss, congratulations. He'll certainly be viable for the fantasy playoffs. All right, let's jump into the quarterbacks and tight ends. Going to keep this a little brief, hopefully a little bit more brief. I think as the season progresses when it comes to the quarterback position, you start to see things really, really even out as it pertains to the top 10, top 12 players. Obviously, we've come a long way from the quarter season recap in which Jordan Love was the quarterback 3 on the season. And now we're seeing something that's, a little bit more indicative of the play that we've seen. Josh Allen, number 1. Well, he's probably the first quarterback taken, so that makes sense. Jalen Hurts, number 2. He was my quarterback 1 in preseason rankings, and he is really not that far behind Josh Allen. He's only 0.5 points per game following Josh Allen. So, I mean, they're both basically the same place. I mean, yes, it's very, very valuable. They've both been incredible for fantasy football, just an absolute cheat code when it comes to fantasy production at the quarterback position. If you have those guys, those are matchup agnostic, set it, forget it. You're squared away when it comes to the quarterback position. Dak Prescott, a guy that has really, really been coming on strong here in the latter half of the season. Same way, in the same vein, we talked about CeeDee Lamb. He was not really utilized in the first few games. When you're blowing out teams like the Giants, like the Patriots, you don't need to rely on the running game. You don't need to rely on your star players like CD or Dak. So, again, the ball was just taken out of his hands far too much for him to put up valuable fantasy points. But over the past 5 games, he has been a wide receiver 5. He's been the top 5 wide receivers, top 5 quarterback in 3 of the past 5 games, and he's been a top 10 quarterback in the past 8 games. And he also has a very, very favorable matchup going forward for the fantasy playoffs. So Dak Prescott, if you have him, or if you trade him from the deadline, I think you should be really set up for the fantasy playoffs. Sam Howell is really here. He is currently leading the NFL in total passing yardage. And again, I have to give my credit to Sam Howell. He has absolutely been a breakout star. I don't think he's going to be, even if he finishes in the top 5 come the end of the season, which I don't think he will, he's not going to be a guy that's going to be drafted top 10 next season. I think they're going to make some very big overhauls to the Washington Commanders team. He is currently in this position due to the fact that a lot of the games that they've been in, they have been in shootouts, and it's mostly based on the decisions of the Washington Commanders front office to get rid of Montez Sweat and Chase Young. So the defense is honestly one of the worst defenses in the NFL currently. It means that they're going to be put in negative game scripts quite often. And if they want to stay competitive, which we know Ron Rivera will, he won't tank. He has too much integrity to do that. He can't just run the ball with Brian Robinson. He's going to have to throw the ball, and it's going to very positively impact Sam Howell. I think at this point, he's a better fantasy football quarterback than he is a real life quarterback. Justin Herbert, this is a regression towards the mean. We know he's a talented quarterback. We know he's a guy that's going to come in. We saw a massive boost to this offense with Kellen Moore coming in and making him a little bit more aggressive. We've seen a larger average depth of target from Justin Herbert, and it's obviously positively reflected for fantasy. Again, a guy, top 5, I think, is a worthy ranking. CJ Stroud. Dude, there's not enough that I can say positively about CJ Stroud right now. He is incredible. He is going to be looked at as a top 5 quarterback going into next season. He is tied to an offense that just, it boosts a lot of the value of quarterbacks and just fantasy players overall. I mean, he's coming from the Shanahan system that's currently making Brock Purdy. People are giving Brock Purdy MVP candidates, and he was Mr. Irrelevant. CJ Stroud is taking that and just absolutely running with it in the Bobby Slowick system down with Houston. I don't think it's wild to say he'll end up as a top 5 quarterback when it's all said and done. I think he might actually leapfrog Sam Howell. CJ Stroud has just been absolutely incredible. And, if you're able to pick him up, draft him late in drafts, or, pick him up when he started to gain steam early on in the season, I think, he's the quarterback you got to roll with. I know a lot of people are talking about, do I start CJ Stroud or Patrick Mahomes? Do I start CJ Stroud or Trevor Lawrence? CJ Stroud or Jared Goff? I mean, CJ is a guy that maybe you can make arguments. I think guys that you can make arguments to start over CJ Stroud right now: Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson. Those are the 4 guys that I would make arguments start over CJ Stroud. Otherwise, I'm playing CJ Stroud. That's how much confidence I have in the rookie right now. Lamar Jackson, it's a travesty he's ranked 7th because he's played much better than this. It just has not fell his way for fantasy. He hasn't gotten the rushing touchdown. He hasn't gotten the passing touchdowns. It's just, they get to the 1-yard line and they rush it in with either Gus Edwards, Justice Hill, Keaton Mitchell, who's come on strong here in the past few games. Again, this is not indicative of the talent and production Lamar Jackson has provided. It is very frustrating as fantasy managers who are seeing this incredible play from Lamar Jackson, and it's just not materializing in the box score for fantasy. But, that is, again, something that this is a touchdown variance, a rushing variance that's unheard of when it comes to fantasy production. So you got to keep playing Lamar Jackson. You hope that has to regress to the mean at some point and he can deliver some and we've seen in the past that he can deliver some very high-end games like Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen do, and hopefully he can deliver those in the fantasy playoffs. Jordan Love, I think this is a little bit overrating him. He's had some pretty dud performances throughout the middle half of the season. He had a great performance on Thanksgiving Day. He started out the season really, really strong in some very positive matchups. He's a guy that, I've used the term matchup mercenary. You can flex him or stream him in a very desperate situation in a very positive matchup, but against a above average defense, I think he's going to, be a very disappointing quarterback. And I think it's just more indicative of Jordan Love being 9th is more indicative of the injuries that have permeated throughout the quarterback scene. I mean, this is in 2023, we've had 10 separate rookies start for NFL teams. So that kind of shows you the state of the quarterbacks. We saw the Aaron Rodgers injury, Deshaun Watson injury, Kirk Cousins injury, Daniel Jones injury. The list goes on. Joe Burrow injury. The list goes on and on and on. So I think this is more, again, same we talk about running backs. He's just been healthy. He's been consistent. He's been on the field. He's had some good games, and therefore he makes it into our top 10 list. Joshua Dobbs, just one of the more incredible stories. We saw kind of some of the flaws of his game exposed by the Bears defense on Monday night. So, with some of the other players behind him, I think, it's great. He has a rushing upside, but again, same way I look at Jordan Love, it's more of like a streaming consideration and more of is the matchup good? Then he might be able to produce. I always play Brock Purdy over him, Tua over him, Jared Goff, Russell Wilson, especially in Week 13 against the Houston Texans. Trevor Lawrence is a guy that I'm playing over Joshua Dobbs with his recent run of form. So that's how I view Joshua Dobbs, despite, my eternal love for the man being just, A, a brilliant person, B, just one of the nicest people on the planet, according to stories, just, a really awesome human being. So I love the story of Joshua Dobbs, Netflix movie in the making for him. And then, these are guys like the guys I just mentioned, the Brock Purdy's, the Tuas, the Jared Goff, the Russell Wilsons, the Trevor Lawrences. These are guys that, they could come out and, we've seen dud gates from them all throughout the season. However, for the most part, they are helming offenses. They are kind of hitting their stride. They're going to deliver that, 302 touchdown benchmark with some rushing yards. They'll deliver you that 20-point fantasy game is going to keep you in it. And generally, if you want 20 points from your quarterback, that should be more than sufficient to keep you in the running, as long as, and then let your other skill position players deliver. So, Brock Purdy, Tua, Jared, Russell, Trevor, these are all guys that I feel very comfortable with starting going into the playoffs. They're not going to lose you a week. They'll be able to just, keep you in contention, and hopefully the rest of the team finds a way to win you a week. But yeah, again, they are products of their environment. They're not guys that are going to go out and single-handedly win you a week. They're not going to go out and just put the team on their back like a Josh Allen or a Jalen Hurts. They're just, they're incompetent offenses like a Tua or a Jared Goff, or like a Brock Purdy, and because they're getting touching the ball so many times, because they are bereft of, a lot of those good offensive minds, they just end up benefiting from the production and play around them. So that's how I would view those 5 guys. Moving on to our last position is going to be tight end. I would love to wrap this up just by saying throw a trash can out of tight end. I'm very anti-tight end. I don't like tight ends. I think they're very irrelevant for fantasy football. I think the position is, I think from a fantasy standpoint is overanalyzed. I don't think we should be really putting that much effort into it. I think, you pick who you got. There's a few guys at the top of the list, like a Travis Kelce, like a TJ Hawkinson, like a Mark Andrews when he's healthy. Those are the guys that you pick in the first 3 to 4 rounds of an NFL draft or a fantasy football draft. And then after that, you wait you figure out who you want at the bottom of the draft and you take someone after you've finished building out your rest of your team. I don't think that, I mean, we've seen these guys in the middle round, whether it's a Dallas Goedert, whether it's a Cole Kmet, whether it's a David Njoku, Evan Ingram. These are all guys that, have left you feeling pretty disappointed for fantasy football. And it's not because of their own incompetence. These are all very, very talented players. It's just, very few tight ends are utilized in the way that the top end tight ends are, whether it's TJ Hawkinson, Travis Kelce, or Mark Andrews. A lot of them, they split their responsibilities between pass catching as well as blocking. They're not going to be, hyper targeted when it comes to the end zone. It's very, very few and far between when you see end zone targets. TJ Hawkinson benefits from the fact that Josh Dobbs targets tight ends in the end zone more than any other quarterback in the NFL over the past 5 years. Travis Kelce benefits from the fact that he is basically the only receiving option on the Kansas City Chiefs right now. Mark Andrews obviously benefits benefited from the Greg Roman system and established a connection with Lamar Jackson over 4 years. But a lot of these other guys, they are tight ends, and they're just not that valuable. I don't really know what to tell you other than that. So yeah, we talked about the top 3 guys. Those are guys that, you unfortunately for Mark Andrews, he's going to be out with the ankle injury after the hip jog tackle from Logan Wilson. So the 2 guys that are for me, set it and forget it for the rest of the playoffs are going to be TJ Hawkinson and Travis Kelce. Obviously number 1 and number 2, and they certainly have earned that position. TJ, I think you should cede the position to Travis Kelce despite his poor run of form recently. I think that's more indicative of the way the game scripts have resulted for Kansas City rather than Travis Kelce's play overall. TJ Hawkinson has just benefited from the standpoint that he's been in more shootouts than with the Vikings than the Chiefs have. George Kittle, talented, super talented, has those boom weeks. We saw against the Cowboys going for a turkey, 3 touchdowns, put up 30 points. But then just the volatility of the 49ers is something that I don't know if I could live with myself. Obviously, if you have George Kittle, you're starting him, but this is why I don't draft George Kittle. It's just because the volatility of whether it's an Ayuk game or a Kittle game or a Debo game is just frustrating beyond belief. Sam Laporta, still, again, just consistent, part of a great offense up there in Detroit under Ben Johnson, is heavily utilized, is targeted at one of the more elite rates we've seen for a rookie tight end. I know it's been a bad couple of games. It was from week 8 to week 11. It was a really poor run of form for Sam Laporta. But, a guy in that offense, his targets aren't going to be impacted by Jameson Williams returning. Donovan Peoples-Jones, even though traded for him hasn't been that relevant. I think Sam Laporta is definitely a guy that he's the number 2 target in the passing offense and should produce enough targets to sustain an adequate volume at tight end position. Guys that I like, Cole Kmet, a little volatile for me. Dalton Schultz, a little too volatile. But again, guys that I think, because Cole Kmet's the commitment to Cole Kmet from the we talked about the extension that the Chicago Bears handed him before the season. Obviously, they put their money where their mouth was with him. He is the number 2 target on the team behind DJ Moore. Cole Kmet obviously is a guy that I like him, and I definitely think he can be started. I would pay attention a little bit to the matchups, but, he'll be there. Dalton Schultz obviously benefits from, we talked about ad nauseum with the Texans, with Tank Dell, Nico Collins, CJ Stroud, and you hope that just Dalton Schultz can find the end zone, but if he doesn't find the end zone, it's normally a pretty poor day for Dalton there. Guys that I like for the playoffs, Jake Ferguson, we've seen him really elevate his game over the latter half of this season. Obviously, as a sophomore, you thought you saw Luke Schoonmaker come in, but the way that Jake Ferguson, he just has a better grasp of the playbook than either Jake Ferguson or Peyton Hendershot, the other 2 tight ends in the tight end room there in Dallas. We know that Dak Prescott is top 5 when it comes to quarterbacks who target the tight end position. We've seen Jake Ferguson have, a pretty good run over the past 4 touchdowns in the past 6 games. He's been, when Dak hasn't been utilizing Brandon Cooks as much, Jake Ferguson was the number 2 target. Now I believe he's been surpassed by Brandon Cooks, but still a very valuable asset in that offense. And I think, we'll see his role grow more and more, especially when they come into a lot of these games. We see for the Dallas Cowboys, they should be in some very competitive games down the stretch with the Eagles. To name one, with the Seattle Seahawks, just some very positive matchups for him. So yeah, Jake Ferguson is a guy that I think if you got off waivers, and you're dealing with an injury to a tight end like a Mark Andrews, he is a very capable backup. David Njoku, again, Was a little disappointing to start out the season, but with the way that now with Dorian Thompson-Robinson and PJ Walker, their target race to the tight end position have been absolutely insane. Also has a very positive matchup run. Over the next 4 games are all very good defenses when it comes to giving up points to the tight end position. So David Njoku, if he's on your bench, he's a guy that I like a lot as a tight end start. Again, I would factor in I'm not going to say he's a set and forget it. I'm saying that because he has so many positive tight end matchups, and from the fact whether it's PJ Walker or Dorian Thompson-Robinson taking over, he will be hyper targeted in that Browns offense, as they don't have the arm strength to get it to Amari Cooper or Elijah Moore. And Dalton Kincaid, during the second half of the season, kind of similar to Sam Laporta. He's just come on really strong. Gabe Davis, even though he had a great week against the Philadelphia Eagles, he's just a guy that's super, super boom bust, super, super volatile. Some games he's there, some games he disappears. I mean, it was only 2 weeks ago he had 0 targets in the first game without Ken Dorsey, and the first game with Joe Brady he had not even like 0 catches, he had 0 targets. But Dalton Kincaid over the past 6 weeks or so has averaged a little bit over 6 targets per game. He's getting enough volume to sustain him as a top 10 tight end. He's not being used as a blocker. He's really being used as a slot pass catcher, which is going to be very valuable, and putting him as the second pass catching option next to Stephon Diggs in an offense like the Buffalo Bills should be very, very beneficial for his fantasy value going forward. So these are 3 guys, kind of like lower value guys that I think are going to be very, very relevant to starting at your tight end position as the playoffs continue to develop for fantasy football. So that's it. Unfortunately, I can't talk about every single player when it comes to fantasy football. I'll be here for 2 hours, and this video has already gone long enough as it is. I'm sure you could tell that I was losing a little bit of steam talking about the tight ends, mostly because it's been 50 minutes, and also I just hate tight ends. But that's where we stand as it comes to the current state of the NFL as it pertains to fantasy football. As we gear up for 1 or 2 more weeks based on your league format, then we hit the playoffs very, very hard, hit the end of the fantasy football, end of the NFL regular season. Obviously there will be a return with my shorts talking about players I would start and sit the rest of the season, and you'll get those throughout the you'll get those throughout week 17, just kind of giving you guys that I feel confident about, or guys that I don't feel confident about going into the season. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully that helps out. And as always, drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think of these standings and some guys that you think will be playoff winners for fantasy football. But until next time, guys, enjoy the football and take care.